Long ago, the Martian Mechanicum formed a critical part of the Imperium of Man as both ally and fundamental building block. Driven by their faith in the machine god, the Omnissiah, believed by some to be represented by the Emperor himself, their technology was incredible and their military might was not insignificant either. And yet, this golden age was not to last, as many members of the Mechanicum were tempted away from the path their brethren were walking by the malignant influence of chaos. Throwing in their lot with Horus and tapping into dark, forbidden technologies, their corruption has warped them both in a physical and mental sense, and they serve as the Forge Masters for some of the forces of chaos, just as their loyalist mirror, the Adeptus Mechanicus, often do for the Imperium. Operating from their corrupted forge worlds inside and outside of the warp, they are the Dark Mechanicum. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. To explain the origins of the Dark Mechanicum, first we need to address the Mechanicum itself and its rather unique relationship with the Imperium. After conquering Terra in the Unification Wars, the Emperor launched his Great Crusade and made pretty much his first stop, depending on if you count Luna I suppose, on Mars. There he spoke to the priesthood of the Martian Mechanicum, who had built their own little empire across the stars following the turmoil of the Age of Strife that had almost scoured the Red Planet. The Emperor not only spoke whilst on Mars, but he acted too, using one assumes his prodigious psychic abilities to repair a Night Titan that had been damaged. Because of this, the Emperor's charisma and perhaps other factors, many on Mars began to see the Emperor as the Omnissiah incarnate, an aspect of the machine god worshipped and venerated by them. This is actually the official doctrine of the modern Cult Mechanicus, incidentally, which makes sense given who would make up the Dark Mechanicum later. This adoration or conversation would culminate in the Treaty of Olympus, a deal made between the Emperor and the Martian Parliament who ruled the Mechanicum in this period. Whether such a body exists today is unknown, or at the very least unclear, however. To put a long story short, the Treaty of Olympus tied the Imperium and the Mechanicum almost inseparably together, whilst allowing both to maintain a level of independence. The Mechanicum would provide armament and other construction for the Great Crusade, including the fleets of the Imperium and other things, and in return, the Imperium would guarantee their sovereignty, including their worship of the Omnissiah, which by the doctrines of the Imperial Truth was outlawed, as well as donating navigators to replenish the stock the Mechanicum had begun to run out of. In all truth, it was a deal that benefited both sides in some ways, though one could argue the Imperium definitely got the better slice of the pie, as without Mars and the Forge Worlds behind it, the Great Crusade may well not have been all that, well, great. The leader of the Martian Parliament, known as the Fabricator General, was the ambassador for the Mechanicum on both the War Council of the Great Crusade and later the Civilian Council of Terra, as well as serving as a de facto leader for the entirety of the Cult Mechanicus. Such was the arrangement throughout the Crusade. Terra did its thing, Mars did its thing, and everyone was happy. Well, actually, maybe not everyone. For you see, there were more than a few people within the Mechanicum who were not as on board with the Treaty of Olympus as others. These individuals saw the Emperor as naught but a conquering warlord, certainly not the physical manifestation of the machine god as others believed. Perhaps worst in their eyes, given their core belief that knowledge is a manifestation of divinity, they believed the Emperor wished to subvert and constrict the knowledge and research of the Mechanicum and lord it over them. Whether this was true or not will likely never be truly known, as the Emperor's motives are often famously hard to comprehend, but the passage of time did nothing to allay those fears. At the cusp of the Horus heresy, the now corrupted War Master would use this simmering discontent and fan its flames into all-out rebellion. Through his network of emissaries and operatives, word would spread that backed up the non-believers in the Emperor, even going so far as suggesting the Emperor wished to become the god of the Mechanicum and enslave them if he had his way. At the same time, Horus himself went on a charm offensive, using his renowned charisma and the promise of technology to win the support and trust of many of the Mechanicum's members. Said technology came from the Oresian technocracy that had recently been wiped out by the Sons of Horus, who had one of the coveted STCs in its possession and perhaps had access to even more. Whether through his own works or those of his agents, the traitor War Master succeeded, and many members of the Mechanicum threw their lot in with him in secret. Remember, this was all before the heresy officially began on Istvan, though it didn't take long for things to get violent. They did not take a new name at this exact time, but it was from this point and these seeds that the Dark Mechanicum was born. The corruption within the Mechanicum went all the way to the top, all the way to the Fabricated General, who we shall discuss more later. Though they were not on Istvan III at the official birth of the Horus Heresy, the Dark Mechanicum, as they would come to be known, were on Istvan V in the Dropsite Massacre, aiding in the construction of the defences of the traitors and unleashing their newfound knowledge upon the ambushed loyalists. At or around the same time, Mars began to tear itself apart as the majority of the Dark Mechanicum rose up in support of Horus. This was the Schism of Mars, begun when an emissary of Horus granted the Dark Mechanicum the means to open the Vault of Moravec. This vault, named after the Primus who built it after fleeing Terra sometime before the coming of the Emperor, I believe, was never to be opened according to the Treaty of Olympus, and the Emperor was wise to stipulate it. Though the full contents of the vaults are unknown, it is believed that the power of the warp was blended with machinery by Moravec within them. By opening them with a certain code, the vaults unleash a torrent of what is known as scrap code, infecting technologies the planet over with junk information and disrupting communication. This was supposed to be the chance for the Dark Mechanicum to conquer the planet, but they were hindered by the newly invented noosphere, a form of communication unaffected by the scrap code that allowed some loyalist forces to coordinate. What followed was effectively baiting from the Dark Mechanicum, trying to give themselves a legitimate reason to wage war on the loyalists, and once they got that excuse, they went all out. Titan Legion clashed with Titan Legion. Corrupted Skitarii and Mortemata besieged the forges of their loyalist brethren, and if Mars wasn't already blasted to ruin by the Age of Strife, then it certainly was by the end of the Schism after the use of virus bombs and other catastrophic weapons. The war didn't actually last all that long, only a year or so in fact, and despite the best efforts of the loyalists, they were unable to best their dark brethren. Even the arrival of Imperial fists under Sigismund could not prevent the victory of the traitors, but thanks to the Astartes, a substantial amount of material was taken from Mars to aid in the ongoing war effort. Of course, while this defeat was already a problem for the Imperials, depriving them of perhaps their primary forge in a time of all-out galactic civil war, the sheer proximity of the Dark Mechanicum's new stronghold to Terra was perhaps just as much of an issue, especially if they could link up with the other traitors. As a result, a blockade was placed around the Red Planet for the duration of the Horus Heresy, with said blockade forming one of the 5 spheres of defense in the Sol system designed by Rogel Dawn. This kept the Dark Mechanicum contained well enough, as the Martian contingent were unable to break the blockade even during the Solar War and the Siege of Terra itself. But it would not be until several years after the heresy that the now victorious Imperials were able to take the planet back for the renamed Adeptus Mechanicus. The name change, for those curious, was due to a problem known as the binary succession, as both Loyalist and Traitor Mechanicum had a fabricated general, the original one a traitor, and a new Loyalist one appointed after the Schism. Therefore, there were technically 2 leaders of the Mechanicum as a faction, hence the Loyalists had to change the name so they didn't have this quandary to become the Mechanicus we know and sort of maybe love today. Beside the successes of Istvan and Mars, little is known of exactly what the Dark Mechanicum got up to throughout the heresy. Those Mechanicum forces attached to the traitor legions will of course have been involved in the battles of said legions when needed or asked, but it is hard to get a true grasp of the scale of their betrayal in terms of number of forge worlds or other numerical proportions. We know that they still had a measure of authority and input with the traitors, as their leader was on Horus's war council that mirrored the Imperial one led in the Great Crusade. As said fabricated general was on Mars, I assume he wasn't there in person, but rather appeared by projection or whatever, since if Magnus the Red could do it, why couldn't he? Perhaps the most interesting question to my mind, however, is what became of their faith. Obviously, having been corrupted to the traitor cause, some if not all of the Dark Mechanicum will have become Chaos devotees, as evidenced today by the prolific use of demon engines and the like. However, the excuse for the Schism of Mars was the renouncing of the machine god by a loyalist Magos. This may have been just that, an excuse and affront to make the war happen, but if it's even slightly true, I have to wonder if members of the Dark Mechanicum still worshipped in part the same things that their counterparts in the Mechanicus did and continue to do. After all, the problem in the equation was the Emperor, not the Omnissiah, not the machine god or the motive force themselves. If anything, the darker knowledge the traitors were harnessing in their new creations was still as divine as an STC by the most basic tenets of the cult Mechanicus. More than likely this wasn't the case, as anyone speaking of the Omnissiah was likely considered too much of a risk in terms of loyalties, but it's an interesting point to consider as opposed to the more obvious worship of chaos in many other traitor forces. It is not stated that the Dark Mechanicum were present in any strength at the Battle of Terra, though the presence of traitor Titan legions makes me think that at least some of them were there to keep the god machines functional before and during the siege of the Imperial Palace. They then joined their traitorous brethren in the flight from Terra following Horus's defeat. Though as already mentioned, the Martian contingent were stuck on the Red Planet until several years later in the Great Scouring. From there, many of the Dark Mechanicum retreated to the Eye of Terror to re-establish themselves, having been forced to flee from the vengeful Imperium. Some may have remained in the material realm, however, probably because they held territory too far-flung for the Scouring to find them, because, well, even the massively defended Mars couldn't hold, so I doubt many other Forge Worlds could. Though I suspect some of them have somehow survived from the Horus Heresy to today, the Dark Mechanicum is almost unrecognisable when compared to both the Adeptus Mechanicus and what it was before turning on the Emperor. It is pretty well known that the warp pervades all who encounter it, especially for those who spend a long time within it, and the Dark Mechanicum are no exception. Their mechanical augmentations are often warped in some way or another. The material known as flesh metal, a fusion of steel and flesh that forms an incredibly durable armour, was likely also a creation of the Dark Mechanicum. Their tech priests, often known as heretics by their loyalist brethren, though the term is not exclusive to servants of chaos, are also believed responsible for the terrifying Obliterator virus, though others suspect or blame Fabius Bile, who is also a master of biology. This virus has a 9-stage infection process, transforming its hapless victim into one of the horrifying insular creatures known as Obliterators, who are often believed perhaps to have initially been tech marines that can now mutate their flesh into durable armour and incredibly destructive weapons on a whim. Interestingly, it does not seem that the Mutilators, the melee equivalent of the Obliterators, are the Dark Mechanicum's creation. There may be a mutilator virus, if you will, but we don't have evidence of its existence, which is interesting. Much like their bodies, the worlds of the Dark Mechanicum also bear heavy chaotic influences upon them. Though it may not be true of every single one, the worlds of the Dark Mechanicum are demonic forge worlds, often known as Hell Forges. These places live up to their name in almost every sense. They are nightmares to live on, much more to work on, and probably even more so to fight on. Some have demons at their heart or in their workings, and like most demon worlds, the laws of reality don't entirely properly apply. The most famous of these worlds is believed to be one of the oldest, and is perhaps, if they have one, the base of operations for the entire Dark Mechanicum. This is Zana 2, a world within the Eye that was taken after the heresy, presumably founded by the Horus-aligned tech priests of the original Zana system in Segmentum Pacificus. Some in fact believe that Zana 2 is the original Zana teleported to the Eye, but whatever the case, it is now one of the most prominent and powerful of the Dark Mechanicum's holdings. Entirely given over to industry and led by heretics likely as demonic as the engines and aircraft they are infamous for creating, Zana 2 stands alone and answers to no one save itself. It is unknown whether there is still a fabricated general or other overall leader for the faction. Given the fractious nature of chaos, I do find it unlikely, but if there is one, it will likely be the overall master of Zana 2 that would be a de facto leader. regardless of their hierarchy and unity or lack thereof. Since their flight in the Great Scouring, the Dark Mechanicum have begun to press back into the material realm. They may not have the same holdings as the Chaos Space Marines or other traitor cults, but the worlds they take are often a double boon. Not only are they often forge worlds that can be corrupted and pressed into service, but if they are forge worlds, they deprive the Mechanicus and thus the Imperium of resources and potentially technology like STCs that are even more vital today than ever before. They do not seemingly reinforce or recruit at the same rate as their peers in the Astartes, as there are less tech priests than space marines to defect, and I doubt they'd allow one of their menial slaves to seize or gain any measure of authority. However, as a counterpoint to their likely low recruitment, I suspect they're a lot harder to kill. Between their technologies and the fact they don't need to fight their battles personally, because when you've got an army of mechanical demonic slaves, why would you? Getting rid of a heretic is probably a lot harder. Plus, if you make an enemy of the wrong tech priest, you've got hell itself coming after you. Demon engines are bread and butter for the Dark Mechanicum, and they create all sorts of other abominations and can even call upon Titan legions in some cases. In more recent times, the Dark Mechanicum have taken advantage of the Cicatrix Maledictum like other forces of chaos, sweeping into the material realm to claim territory or simply to raid. However, unlike many of the forces of chaos who can be rather random in their mass murder, the Dark Mechanicum have specific goals with all of their attacks. It is thought they are hunting down ancient archaeotech, though how successful they have been to this point is actually unknown. Their supposed goal is the creation of a superweapon, of a power unseen since the Dark Age of technology, when humanity and its technology were likely at their peak. If true, and especially if realized, things bode awfully ill for the galaxy and the Imperium. We have seen glimpses of this archaeotech with the Arx Mechanicus, and if such a thing can be reintroduced to the Long War, it could do cataclysmic damage. So, simply put, I sincerely hope that if you're the Dark Mechanicum, you never succeed in your mission, if that's what it is, because I quite fancy living a bit longer, thank you very much. The membership of the Dark Mechanicum is a twisted bunch today, but perhaps the first of them all was, of course, their original leader. Kelbor Hal was a member of the Mechanicum when the Emperor came, and so was probably Martian-born. And like I suspect many of the future traitors, he never welcomed the Master of Mankind like his peers. In fact, his mindset was one of fear, thinking that the Emperor was going to strip away Martian autonomy and the like. To an extent, he'd come to be proven right, given the bonds between Terra and Mars after the heresy, but that's not any of his business. However, either wishing to stop the Emperor's dominion or otherwise claim authority himself, or maybe just honour the machine god as best he could, Kelbor Hal would work his way up the ranks of the Mechanicum. Eventually, he would become the Fabricator General himself, taking his place on the War Council on behalf of the Martian Parliament. How much input he had and such is unclear, but he must have been a pretty decent politician as well as, of course, a master engineer. He also was present at the infamous Council of Nicaea, being part of the opposition to Magnus the Red and Psykers as a whole. It is stated his opposition was vehement, so he really didn't like Psykers. Given the Emperor was one, maybe that played into it to some extent, but then also it's not technology so yeah, maybe that. The fall of Kelbor Hal into betrayal only happened thanks to Horus and his emissaries, as previously mentioned. But in truth, Mars was a powder keg of distrust already at the time of the heresy's beginning. Horus took advantage and secured the loyalty of Hal and co. with his promises of independence and the opening of the vaults of Moravec, and the rest, as they say, is mechanical, blood-stained history. However, whilst the Dark Mechanicum won on Mars, the fate of Kelbor Hal long-term is something of a mystery. It is said that in the very early Heresy or Late Crusade, perhaps even before Istvan, Kelbor Hal and the Dark Mechanicum constructed the Furious Abyss over Jupiter as a gift for the Word-Bearers. So things are a little hazy in terms of timelines and the like, given the Dark Mechanicum was said to be stuck on Mars after the Schism, but we didn't see the Abyss until Cal, so why wasn't on Istvan 5, and so on and so forth. However, we also do not know whether Kelbor Hal made it out alive. Assuming he was stuck on Mars after the schism, he would have been there in the Great Scouring, and so likely he would have been killed in it. If he fled, he's never been heard from again, so I do suspect he is dead just because no one goes that quiet for that long as a leader of a faction for Chaos unless they're either dead or their name's Lorgar. There are two other particularly infamous Dark Mechanicum members from the early days, Dracovac of Cyclothrathi and Scoria of none other than Zana itself. Dracovac was already a dark individual by the time of the Horus Heresy, known for sacrificing anything and anyone in pursuit of his goals, and so trading the promise of forbidden law for loyalty seems very much like him. His main action in the heresy was the Battle of the Coronid Deeps, where his forge world was already located, or at least close to, where his Dark Mechanicum forces seemed to act as both ambassador and conqueror in several sectors, even though the overall war was something of a stalemate. As for Anacharis Scoria, he was a Magos Dominus and thus a master of battle robotics. Other famous ones include the commander of the Mechanicum in the War in the Webway and a certain Belisarius Cawl many millennia later. However, for reasons unknown, he was cast down from his position. Whether it was linked to the heresy or to another event, etc., does remain unclear. He was held prisoner on his forge world of Zana and expunged from all records, even as the current masters of the world prepared to ally themselves with Horus, as mentioned earlier. This went on until the Zana incursion, a raid initially by Black Shields, later joined by the Dark Angels and Shattered Legionaries, attempting to make off with Ordinatus weapons promised to the traitor Warmaster. The raid was ultimately a great success, with the weapons either taken or destroyed, and the Zana-Horus alliance massively delayed. But there was one accidental catch. Though none know how, Scoria was accidentally freed in the incursion, later reappearing to take at least some measure of control on Zana as a leading figure in the Dark Mechanicum. Through Scoria's efforts, some of the first Hellforges ever built were constructed, and given his scorpion-like appearance, I can't help but think the Magos Dominus gave himself something of a makeover once they were ready. Sadly, we do not know the fates of either Scoria or Dracovac, but I suspect the former especially went on to bigger and more terrifying things, given what Zana 2 became later. In the modern era, one of the better-known Dark Mechanicum members was attached to a warband of the Iron Warriors, likely a not uncommon situation as their warpsmiths will almost certainly have relations to the traitorous tech priest in terms of shared knowledge, or tech, or whatever. Vothir Tark's betrayal may have been before his rebellion on the world of Uraniborg 1572, helping to transform it from a loyalist forge world into a traitor Hellforge. Eventually he would make his way to New Badab, home of the Red Corsairs within the Maelstrom, where he bore witness to the tournament known as the Skull Harvest held by Huron Blackheart to win resources and favour. He wasn't in it personally, since it's death for all save the victor, and he didn't win. Swearing allegiance to the eventual winner, Honsu of the Iron Warriors, Tark joined the invasion of the Ultramar system led by the Warsmith tasked with taking the planet Quintarn. Though his tactical sense was very, very off, he could harvest resources exponentially quickly to churn out more war machines, to the point that Chaplain Ortan Cassius compared fighting him to fighting the Tyranids, and if anyone's gonna know, it's gonna be Cassius. Unfortunately, this initial strength would be his undoing, as an infiltrating force led by Scout Sergeant Tellian was able to destroy his forges and thus lead to his forces being utterly crushed. We don't know if he made it out alive, but since the traitors were driven off from Ultramar, I'd be surprised if he did somehow, because, yeah, you're in the Ultramar segmentum, no, he's probably dead. And there you have it, a window into the Dark Mechanicum's origins, actions, and members. In some ways, I can understand their betrayal of the Emperor, as he may well have planned to lord it over Mars eventually. We'll probably never know, but it was possible. However, the twisted individuals they have become and the abominations they create means I no longer sympathise with them as I might have if I were around millennia ago. Their Hellforges are aptly named, one of the many places in the galaxy I highly suggest you avoid if you fancy an existence that isn't either eternal suffering or incredibly violent death, and I sincerely hope their current superweapon mission isn't realised, lest the nightmares of the even more ancient past blight the galaxy again. And now, onwards we must go. Recently we told the tales of the Minotaurs, a rather infamous group of Astartes with some rather interesting quirks. However, they aren't the only such chapter, and so I wish to look at another one or two like them, including one that we shall be addressing next time. For now though, thank you very much for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.